She said she trusted me, but she never knew the truth. The words hung in the glass-walled boardroom like a weight no one dared to touch. William Carter stood at the head of a long mahogany table on the 42nd floor of Carter Global Headquarters in Chicago, the city lights outside stretching across the skyline like scattered memories he could no longer organize. At 38, he had built an empire that moved markets with a single decision, yet in this moment his authority felt distant, almost irrelevant. The executives seated around him waited for direction, but William's attention had drifted somewhere far beyond the numbers on the screen, somewhere quieter, sharper, and far more personal. He lowered his gaze slightly, as if seeing something no one else in the room could see, and continued in a voice controlled but layered with something unspoken. Every decision I made, I believed it was the right one. No one interrupted him. That was the rule when William spoke like this, rare, deliberate, unsettling. He turned slightly toward the city lights, hands resting loosely at his sides, his reflection faint against the glass. Years ago, he had learned to separate emotion from leadership, to survive by logic alone. Yet tonight, that separation felt thinner than ever. 3 years, he said quietly, almost to himself. And I still hear her say it like it happened yesterday. The room remained silent, unsure whether they were witnessing a strategy meeting or something far more personal unraveling in real time. He exhaled slowly, straightening his posture, the CEO returning for a moment as he addressed the room again. We proceed with the acquisition in Dallas. Final approval tomorrow morning. Heads nodded, laptops shifted, chairs moved softly against the floor, but William was already mentally elsewhere. As the meeting dissolved and executives filtered out into the corridor, William remained behind alone, the city pressing in beyond the glass. He loosened his cuff slightly, a rare gesture of tension, and reached for his phone without fully deciding to. One name remained buried deeper in his memory than any contract or deal: Sarah Miller. The last time he had seen her, there had been no dramatic farewell, no shouting, no collapse into chaos. Only a quiet breaking of something neither of them had known how to repair. A misunderstanding that had grown too large to correct in time. He had left not because he stopped caring, but because he believed distance would protect her from the consequences closing in around his world. That was the truth he had never told her. His phone lit up briefly with a calendar reminder he did not need. Foundation visit, Mercy Medical Center, 9 a.m. For a moment, he stared at it longer than necessary. Something about that location had been pulling at him for weeks without explanation, like an unfinished sentence waiting for the right moment to be spoken. He locked the screen, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and walked toward the elevator as the office lights dimmed automatically behind him. The doors closed with a soft metallic whisper, sealing him inside with his reflection. As the elevator descended, William's expression remained composed, but beneath it, something unresolved tightened quietly. Somewhere in the same city, a life he once knew was still moving forward without him, and he had no idea that within hours, the past he had carefully buried would stop waiting to stay hidden. The early morning light over Mercy Medical Center was pale and indifferent, casting long reflections across the polished floors as Sarah Miller stood at the entrance holding her daughter's small hand. Her grip was gentle but protective, as if letting go even for a second would allow the world to take something else from her. At just 29, she already carried the kind of exhaustion that did not come from lack of sleep alone, but from years of choosing between survival and stability. Her daughter, Lily, looked up at her with quiet eyes that still held trust, unaware of how carefully every step of their lives had been measured in dollars and hope. Sarah inhaled slowly before walking inside, the scent of antiseptic and clean air mixing with a feeling she could not name. She had been here before, too many times, always with paperwork folded in half and a heart trying to stay steady. Today was supposed to be another postponed appointment, another reminder that priorities had to be sacrificed, but something had changed. A phone call that morning had turned delay into possibility. The reception desk confirmed her name with unexpected ease, as if someone had already made the path clear before she arrived. She did not know that across the city, William Carter had already ensured every barrier was temporarily gone. She only knew that for once, she was not being told to come back later. Lily squeezed her hand lightly as they were guided down a quiet corridor, her small steps echoing softly against the floor. Sarah noticed how calm everything felt, how unusually prepared the staff seemed for their arrival, and a cautious suspicion flickered beneath her exhaustion. People like her did not usually move through places like this without resistance. Yet here she was, being led forward without questions, without delay, without cost being mentioned. It unsettled her more than it comforted her. When they reached the consultation room, Sarah paused for a moment at the doorway, instinctively scanning the space as if expecting a mistake to reveal itself. Instead, she found warmth in the lighting, order in the arrangement, and a quiet professionalism that felt almost too smooth to be accidental. A nurse greeted them with a calm smile and asked them to sit, explaining that the specialist would arrive shortly. Sarah nodded politely, settling into the chair while adjusting Lily's jacket, her fingers brushing through her daughter's hair in a repetitive motion meant to hide her nerves. Minutes passed in a silence filled only with distant footsteps and soft page turns from unseen staff. Then, unexpectedly, Sarah noticed a familiar emblem on a folder placed near the desk, one she had seen years ago in contexts she had tried to forget. Carter Global Foundation. Her chest tightened slightly. She had no connection to that world anymore, not since everything had ended without warning, without explanation that ever felt complete. The memory of William Carter surfaced uninvited, not as the powerful figure the world saw, but as the man who once listened differently when no one else did. She quickly dismissed the thought, telling herself it was coincidence, nothing more. People like him did not cross paths with people like her again. At least, that was what she believed. Outside the room, in a glass corridor overlooking the hospital courtyard, William stood quietly with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the movement below without drawing attention to himself. He had not entered the room yet. He had reviewed the schedule, adjusted the appointments, and ensured everything aligned without revealing why. He told himself it was part of the Foundation's work, a standard act of oversight, nothing personal. Yet his focus remained fixed on one closed door. He had not expected her to be there. Not like this. Not now. The distance he had carefully maintained for years suddenly felt less like protection and more like avoidance. A staff member approached him briefly, mentioning that the patient had arrived early and everything was proceeding smoothly. William nodded once, offering no additional instruction, but his attention never left the corridor. For a moment, he allowed himself to observe without analysis, something he rarely did anymore. The image of Sarah entering the building had already disrupted the controlled structure of his day in a way no boardroom ever could. He checked his watch once, then looked back toward the room, unaware that the next few minutes would determine whether the past remained buried or finally spoke again. Sarah Miller sat quietly in the consultation room, her fingers still gently resting on her daughter's small hand, as if any movement might disturb the fragile sense of stability she had managed to hold together that morning. The room was calm, almost too calm, with soft lighting that made everything feel controlled and distant from the chaos she was used to. Lily sat beside her, swinging her feet slightly, unaware of the weight her mother carried in every breath. Sarah kept her eyes forward, focusing on the sound of distant footsteps in the hallway, trying not to let her thoughts wander too far into uncertainty. Then the door opened. A physician entered first, followed by a brief pause that felt unremarkable to anyone else, but carried an unusual stillness for Sarah, as if the air itself had changed temperature. The doctor introduced himself politely, reviewing notes with professional ease, but Sarah barely heard the words. Her attention shifted for a brief moment toward the glass window across the hall, where she thought she saw a familiar silhouette move past and then disappear. It was gone before she could confirm it, yet the feeling it left behind lingered longer than reason allowed. Meanwhile, just outside that same corridor, William Carter stood motionless for a moment longer than he intended. He had seen her through the glass reflection before she had noticed anything, and in that instant, something he had carefully contained for years tightened again in his chest. She looked the same in ways that mattered and different in ways that time always demands. He told himself he was there for oversight, for responsibility, for structure, anything except the truth that had no place in a corporate explanation. When the physician stepped out briefly to retrieve additional files, William finally moved closer to the door. He did not enter. Instead, he remained just outside, listening to fragments of conversation, hearing a voice he had once known in quieter circumstances. Inside, Sarah answered questions about Lily's condition with careful precision, her tone steady even as her thoughts began to drift. She noticed how quickly the medical process was moving, how nothing felt delayed or uncertain, and yet she had not signed anything beyond the usual forms. It felt as though invisible arrangements had already been made on her behalf. The physician mentioned that a full consultation had been approved in advance, fully covered under a foundation program. Sarah paused at those words, her pen hovering slightly above the paper. She had never qualified for anything like that before. She looked down at Lily, then back at the doctor, trying to understand how something so significant could arrive without explanation. Outside the room, William exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor for a brief moment before returning to the closed door. He knew exactly how it would sound to her if she ever discovered the source. Too clean, too convenient, too personal to feel random. That was the risk he had not yet decided how to manage. A nurse passed by and greeted him briefly, but he responded with a small nod, keeping his presence minimal, almost invisible. Inside the room, Sarah's consultation continued, but her awareness had begun to split between what was being said and what was not being said. There were patterns here she could not fully interpret, small consistencies that suggested intention behind the care she was receiving. Lily reached up and touched her mother's sleeve, bringing her attention back into the room. Sarah smiled softly at her daughter, masking the unease that had begun to settle just beneath her calm expression. She did not know that the man she had once trusted without reservation was standing only a few steps away, choosing silence over explanation, and that the distance between them was now measured in nothing more than a closed door. The corridor outside the consultation room remained quiet, but for William Carter, silence had never felt heavier. He stood near the far end of the hallway where the glass windows overlooked a small inner courtyard, his hands resting in his coat pockets, posture composed in a way that no one passing by would question. Yet his focus was not on the architecture or the movement of staff moving between rooms. It was on a single door that remained closed, separating him from a past he had spent years trying not to disturb. Inside that room, Sarah Miller continued the consultation, unaware of how close her life had just come to intersecting with the part of her history she believed had ended completely. William shifted slightly, glancing at his watch, then back toward the door, as if timing could help him control something far less predictable than schedules or meetings. A nurse walked past and greeted him politely, recognizing him without hesitation, but he responded with only a brief nod, maintaining the distance he had carefully built. He told himself again that his presence here was procedural, tied to oversight through the foundation, nothing more. But the explanation felt thinner each time he repeated it. Internally. Inside the room, Sarah listened as the physician reviewed next steps for Lily's treatment plan, explaining everything in careful detail. Sarah nodded when appropriate, asked questions when necessary, but her awareness kept drifting back to the unusual clarity of the process. There were no delays, no financial discussions, no uncertainty about coverage. Everything had already been arranged with precision that did not match her circumstances. She tightened her hold on her daughter's hand without realizing it, a subtle instinctive response to something she could not yet define. Lily looked up at her mother and smiled briefly, unaffected by the tension beneath the surface. That small expression grounded Sarah again, pulling her attention back into the room. The physician mentioned follow-up appointments already scheduled for the coming weeks, all coordinated through a foundation liaison. Sarah paused slightly at the word liaison but said nothing, choosing instead to focus on the immediate needs in front of her. When the consultation ended, she was handed a folder containing medical instructions, appointment details, and confirmation of full coverage. She accepted it with cautious gratitude, still unsure why something so significant had been made so simple. As she stood to leave, she glanced once more toward the hallway through the small window in the door. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement again, a figure stepping away just out of view. It unsettled her, not because it was threatening, but because it felt familiar in a way she could not place. Outside, William finally turned away from the glass, his expression controlled but distant. He had heard enough to know the process had gone exactly as intended. Everything had been handled without exposure, without disruption, without acknowledgement of his involvement. That was how it needed to remain. Yet as he started walking down the corridor, his steps slower than usual, he realized that control did not feel as absolute as it once had. Behind him, the door opened, and Sarah stepped out holding Lily close. Their paths were separated by only a few yards, but neither of them turned at the exact moment that might have changed everything. William continued forward toward the elevator, while Sarah walked in the opposite direction toward the exit, each carrying the weight of something unspoken, either yet aware that the distance between them was no longer just physical, but something time would soon force them to confront again. Sarah Miller stepped out of the hospital entrance holding Lily close to her chest, the cold air of the afternoon wrapping around them like a quiet reminder that the world outside continued moving no matter what had just changed inside those walls. She adjusted her daughter's jacket, making sure the zipper was fully closed, her movements careful and automatic, as if routine could stabilize the lingering uncertainty she felt but could not yet name. Behind her, the sliding glass doors closed softly, sealing away the clinical brightness of the medical corridors and the strange sense of order she had experienced there. She paused briefly on the sidewalk, looking down at Lily, who leaned her head against her shoulder with the innocent trust of a child who did not understand financial strain, medical complexity, or the invisible weight pressing on her mother's life. Sarah exhaled slowly, trying to settle her thoughts into something manageable. But the feeling remained that something had shifted today in a way she could not fully understand. The coverage, the scheduling, the ease of everything, it all felt too precise to be coincidence, yet there was no explanation offered, no name she recognized attached to the decisions that had been made on her behalf. She began walking toward the bus stop, her steps steady but quieter than usual, her mind replaying fragments of the consultation, especially the repeated mention of the Foundation liaison. She had worked enough jobs in her life to recognize systems that did not usually extend generosity without reason. Yet there had been no request, no condition, only support delivered with almost clinical efficiency. As she reached the corner and waited for the light to change, she glanced briefly back at the hospital building rising behind her. Somewhere inside that structure, decisions had been made that affected her life without her direct involvement, and that realization carried a weight she did not know how to categorize. Meanwhile, several blocks away, William Carter stood inside the elevator descending from the upper executive levels of a nearby building, his reflection framed against the brushed steel doors. He had left the hospital shortly after Sarah exited, timing his departure with careful precision to avoid any possibility of crossing paths again. That detail alone should have reassured him, but instead it left him with a lingering sense of unfinished awareness. The elevator numbers ticked downward in quiet intervals, each floor marking a return toward the controlled environment he understood better than anything else. Yet his thoughts did not follow the usual structure of meetings or obligations. Instead, they remained anchored to brief, fragmented impressions from earlier that day. The sound of her voice through a door. The way she had held her daughter without hesitation despite uncertainty. The calm strength in her responses even when nothing around her was stable. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if distance alone could restore clarity, but the images remained. When the elevator reached the ground floor, the doors opened to a polished lobby filled with quiet movement and soft conversations, the world of business resuming its predictable rhythm. William stepped out, adjusting his coat, reasserting the familiar discipline of presence that had defined him for years. A staff member approached with a brief update regarding Foundation logistics, and he listened without interruption, offering only minimal acknowledgement. Everything had been executed according to plan. There were no visible traces, no procedural errors, no need for further involvement. Yet, as he walked toward the exit, he felt a subtle disruption beneath that structure, something he had not accounted for in any operational review. Outside, the city continued in its usual motion, taxis moving along the street, pedestrians crossing with focused urgency, life unfolding in ordinary patterns that contrasted sharply with the internal stillness he carried. William paused for only a second before stepping forward again, telling himself that the matter was closed, contained, resolved within appropriate boundaries. But as he merged into the crowd, the thought remained that some intersections in life did not end simply because distance was maintained, and that what had been carefully separated might still find a way to return. Sarah Miller sat on the bus near the window, holding Lily close as the city slowly blurred past in muted colors of late afternoon light, her reflection faintly visible against the glass as if she were watching someone else's life unfold instead of her own. Lily had fallen into a light sleep, her small breath steady and warm against Sarah's shoulder, and for a moment, Sarah allowed herself to relax just enough to feel the weight of the day settling into something less chaotic. The hospital visit still replayed in her mind, not as a single moment but as fragments she could not fully connect. The approval of care without hesitation, the mention of the foundation, the smooth coordination of everything that normally required long waits and financial negotiation. It was not the help itself that unsettled her, but the absence of explanation behind it. She had learned over the years that nothing significant arrived without a reason, and yet today had offered support without visible costs. As the bus turned onto a wider avenue, Sarah shifted slightly, adjusting Lily's position, and stared out at the passing buildings. Somewhere in those structures, decisions had been made that directly shaped her day, her daughter's care, and her immediate future, all without her being part of the conversation. She did not know that the name behind those decisions had once been tied to her life more closely than she had ever fully understood. Meanwhile, in a private office across town, William Carter stood alone with the evening light stretching across the floor-to-ceiling windows, his attention not on the documents on his desk but on the silent phone resting beside them. He had not expected to receive any further updates regarding the hospital case, yet the confirmation report from the Foundation had arrived earlier than scheduled. Everything had proceeded exactly as planned. Coverage activated. Consultations completed. No procedural complications. On paper, the situation was resolved. In reality, William found himself reading the same lines more than once without absorbing their finality. He leaned slightly back against the edge of his desk, exhaling slowly, as if trying to release a tension he could not fully identify. For years he had made decisions that affected thousands of lives without hesitation or emotional interference. Yet this particular case, simple in structure and minimal in scope, remained present in his awareness longer than it should have. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and his assistant entered briefly to update him on the next morning's schedule. William listened, nodded once, and dismissed the conversation efficiently, returning to silence as soon as the door closed. But the silence no longer felt neutral. It felt occupied. Later that evening, Sarah arrived home in a small apartment complex on the edge of the city, carrying Lily inside with practiced care. The hallway lights flickered slightly as she walked, and the familiar sound of distant televisions and muted conversations from neighboring units created a sense of ordinary life returning after an unusual day. She placed Lily gently in her crib, watching for a moment as her daughter shifted in sleep, then pulled a blanket over her with slow precision. Only when she was sure Lily was comfortable did she allow herself to sit at the edge of the bed, placing the hospital folder on the small table beside her. The documents were still neatly arranged, still official, still difficult to interpret emotionally. She opened them again, scanning through names and instructions, pausing once more at the mention of the Foundation liaison. There was still no personal contact, no direct explanation, no visible source behind the arrangement. Her phone buzzed softly on the table, pulling her attention away. The screen showed an unknown number with a single short message confirming a follow-up appointment had been scheduled and transportation assistance would be provided if needed. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before placing the phone down again without responding. Across the city, William stood by his apartment window overlooking the skyline, his tie loosened, his posture no longer as rigid as it had been earlier in the day. The city lights stretched endlessly before him, yet his focus remained narrowed on something far less distant. He had not authorized a personal follow-up message, but he recognized the system behind it. It was efficient, appropriate, and completely standard. And still, he found himself wondering whether distance alone was enough to keep certain parts of life from resurfacing. He turned away from the window and walked back into the quiet of his apartment, unaware that the next message, the next scheduled appointment, and the next carefully arranged coincidence would begin shifting the balance between two lives that had already crossed once before without either of them fully understanding what had been set in motion. The morning arrived with a pale quietness that felt heavier than usual for Sarah Miller, as if the city itself had slowed down to match the uncertainty she carried from the previous day. She stood in the small kitchen of her apartment holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring at the message on her phone that confirmed transportation assistance for Lily's upcoming appointment. The words were simple, polite, and professionally structured, yet they carried a presence that felt too deliberate to ignore. She had worked long enough in life to recognize when convenience was not accidental, and this level of coordination did not belong to chance. Lily sat on the floor nearby playing quietly with a small toy, occasionally looking up at her mother, as if sensing the subtle tension in the room. Sarah forced herself to breathe evenly, reminding herself that support, even unexplained support, was still something she could not afford to reject. Across the city, William Carter stood in his office reviewing the same schedule that had been adjusted multiple times since the previous day. The morning light reflected off the glass wall behind him, casting a clean geometric brightness across the polished surface of his desk, but his attention remained on a single entry in the calendar. The follow-up pediatric consultation tied to the foundation coverage had been moved forward at his request, though he had not formally documented the reason beyond administrative necessity. His assistant had handled the logistics with efficiency, ensuring everything appeared routine. That was important. Everything needed to appear routine. Yet William found himself pausing longer than necessary on the details of the appointment location. Mercy Medical Center again. The same place. The same time window. He leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk, and allowed a rare moment of reflection to surface. It would have been easier, he told himself, if he had not recognized her. If the past had remained properly contained. But recognition had a way of disrupting even the most carefully structured systems. He closed the file on his screen and stood, deciding not because of impulse but because the schedule allowed it, that he would attend the appointment in person under the guise of foundation oversight. It was not unusual for him to review cases directly. It was, in fact, standard practice. That distinction mattered more than he allowed himself to admit. By midday, Sarah had prepared everything for Lily's appointment, placing the medical folder carefully into her bag and checking the transportation confirmation twice before leaving the apartment. The car that arrived outside was discreet, unmarked, and driven by someone who offered no unnecessary conversation. The experience was smooth, efficient, and unsettling in its lack of friction. As they drove through the city streets, Sarah watched the buildings pass by, her thoughts circling the same unanswered question. Who was coordinating this, and why had her life suddenly become so easy to navigate without explanation? Lily leaned against her shoulder, calm and unaware, and Sarah gently adjusted her hold, grounding herself in the present. Meanwhile, William arrived at the hospital through a private entrance, avoiding the main lobby and moving through a series of internal corridors that allowed him to remain unseen by most staff. He reviewed the appointment notes briefly before entering the observation area adjacent to the consultation room. From there, he could see without being directly seen, a position he had learned to use over years of leadership and control. Yet today, that distance felt less like authority and more like hesitation. When Sarah arrived, he observed her before she entered the room, noting the same careful posture, the same quiet strength in the way she carried her daughter despite everything. There was no performance in her movements, no adaptation to the environment she found herself in. She simply existed within it, steady and composed in a way that did not require validation. William watched as she spoke briefly with the receptionist, confirming her appointment with polite clarity, and then moved toward the waiting area. Something inside him tightened again, not sharply, but persistently, as if a long-sealed memory had begun pressing gently against its container. He told himself again that this was oversight, nothing more, a standard review of Foundation-supported care. Yet as Sarah sat down with Lily and opened the medical folder, William remained in place longer than necessary, observing not the system, but the person within it. And for the first time in a long time, he found himself wondering whether control was still the same thing as distance, or whether some forms of distance had already stopped being under his control entirely. The consultation room was filled with a soft, controlled quiet as Sarah Miller sat beside Lily, her hands resting lightly over the medical folder that now felt heavier than paper should. The physician spoke in a calm and measured tone, explaining that Lily's condition was stable and that the upcoming treatment plan would focus on long-term management rather than urgent intervention. Sarah listened carefully, nodding when appropriate, but her attention kept drifting to the subtle sense that everything had been arranged with unusual precision. There was no hesitation in scheduling, no financial discussion interrupting care, no uncertainty that she had grown accustomed to in every previous medical visit. It felt like walking through a path that had already been cleared before she arrived. Across the observation area behind the glass, William Carter remained still, his presence unnoticed by anyone inside the room. He watched not as a CEO reviewing operations, but as a man observing a life unfolding in real time without interference. Sarah's composure, even under circumstances that should have carried anxiety, stood out in a way he could not ignore. She asked questions with clarity, not panic. She adjusted Lily's position with instinctive care, not distraction. There was no performance in her actions, only consistency. A nurse briefly entered the room to provide additional instructions, and Sarah thanked her politely, her voice steady. William noted the way she absorbed information without losing focus, as if every detail mattered equally regardless of circumstance. It was a trait he recognized in leadership environments, yet here it existed without structure or authority. It simply was. The physician concluded the consultation by confirming that follow-up visits had already been arranged through the Foundation system, including transportation support and priority scheduling. Sarah paused for a fraction of a second at the mention of the Foundation again, her expression tightening slightly before she nodded in acknowledgement. She did not question further, but William saw the moment of internal calculation, the quiet awareness that something larger was operating beneath her experience. As the appointment ended and the physician left the room, Sarah gathered Lily into her arms and stood, preparing to leave. William shifted slightly behind the glass, instinctively stepping back just enough to remain unseen as the door opened. Sarah walked out slowly, adjusting her daughter's blanket, her eyes briefly scanning the corridor ahead. For a brief moment, her gaze moved in the direction of the observation area, but she did not stop or linger. She continued forward, unaware of how close she had come to something she was not yet meant to recognize. William remained in place until she disappeared from view, the corridor returning to silence once again. Only then did he exhale slowly, as if releasing a thought he had not realized he was holding. The system had functioned exactly as intended, every protocol followed, every outcome aligned with expectation. Yet the sense of resolution he usually associated with completion was absent. Instead, there was something unfinished, subtle but persistent, like a line of code that had executed correctly but produced a result he had not anticipated. He turned away from the glass and began walking back through the corridor, his steps measured, controlled, and familiar. Staff members passed without acknowledging anything unusual, reinforcing the illusion of routine. But as William moved toward the exit, his attention remained divided between the structure he had built and the quiet disruption that had entered it without permission. Somewhere behind him, Sarah Miller was already leaving the building with her daughter, unaware that the distance between their paths had narrowed again, not by accident, but by a series of decisions that were no longer entirely invisible. Sarah Miller stepped out of Mercy Medical Center with Lily resting calmly against her shoulder, the afternoon light softer now as if the city had briefly paused its urgency to allow her a moment of quiet between uncertainties. The medical folder was tucked securely inside her bag, but its weight still felt present in her thoughts, not because of what it contained, but because of how effortlessly everything had been arranged around her. She adjusted her grip on Lily as they walked toward the pickup point where the transportation service had promised to return, her eyes scanning the street in a habit formed by years of managing life alone. Nothing about the world around her gave any indication of the invisible structure that had been operating behind her day, yet she could feel its absence in the form of questions that remained unanswered. She did not know that William Carter was only a few blocks away, sitting in the back of a black car that had not yet merged into traffic, his attention fixed not on his phone or schedule, but on the brief report he had just received confirming that the appointment had concluded without incident. The message was simple and procedural, yet William read it twice before lowering the device slowly into his hand. Everything had gone exactly as planned, yet his focus did not settle in the way it usually did after successful execution. Instead, there was a lingering awareness that the outcome, while correct, had not resolved the internal tension that had been building since the first unexpected encounter. He looked out through the tinted window at the passing street, watching pedestrians move through intersections without awareness of the systems operating above and beneath their daily routines. Somewhere in that flow, Sarah Miller was now returning home, and the thought of that simple fact carried a weight he had not anticipated. Meanwhile, Sarah reached the corner where the transport car was waiting, securing Lily into her seat before settling beside her. The ride began smoothly, the city sliding past in muted colors and familiar shapes, but her mind remained partially anchored to the hospital. She replayed the sequence of events again, trying to identify where explanation should have been offered but was instead replaced by seamless coordination. It was not gratitude that unsettled her, but the absence of clarity. People did not receive this level of assistance without reason, and yet no reason had been given. As the car turned onto a wider avenue, Sarah noticed her phone vibrate softly in her bag. She hesitated before checking it, finding another brief confirmation message regarding follow-up care. The tone was polite, efficient, and impersonal, yet it reinforced the same pattern she had been experiencing all day. Everything was being handled before she needed to ask. Across the city, William finally instructed his driver to begin moving, the vehicle merging into traffic as he leaned back slightly, his expression controlled but distant. He had reviewed every aspect of the Foundation's involvement, and found nothing incorrect, nothing that violated procedure or expectation. And yet the absence of error did not resolve the discomfort he could not define. It was not the system that concerned him. It was the fact that for the first time in years, a system he controlled had produced an outcome that lingered beyond completion. Sarah arrived home as evening began to settle over the neighborhood, carrying Lily inside with practiced ease. The apartment was quiet, familiar, and unchanged, yet she moved through it with a different awareness than she had left with that morning. After placing Lily in her crib, she stood for a moment in the doorway, watching her daughter sleep peacefully, and allowed herself a rare pause. The day had ended without crisis, without loss, without struggle, but it had not ended without questions. She turned away slowly and walked toward the small table where the medical folder rested, untouched since her return. Somewhere in the city, William Carter reviewed his schedule once more before closing it entirely for the evening, but neither of them, in their separate silence, could fully dismiss the sense that something had already begun shifting beneath the surface of their lives, something neither structure nor distance had successfully contained. Sarah Miller sat at the small kitchen table that night with the medical folder still open in front of her, though she had already read every page more than once. The apartment was quiet except for the faint sound of Lily breathing in her crib, a steady rhythm that anchored her more than anything else in the room. The overhead light cast a soft glow across the table, highlighting the edges of paperwork that should have felt routine but instead carried an unusual weight. She had expected relief after the hospital visit, expected the kind of exhaustion that comes after long hours of worry finally being replaced with clarity, but what remained instead was a lingering sense of something incomplete. Everything had been too smooth, too coordinated, too perfectly arranged to match the life she knew. Sarah closed the folder slowly, leaning back in her chair as her thoughts drifted again to the hospital corridor, to the brief moment when she had thought she saw someone familiar but could not confirm it. She told herself it was fatigue, the kind that comes from too many nights of balancing responsibilities alone, yet the feeling persisted like a quiet echo she could not dismiss. Meanwhile, across the city, William Carter stood in his apartment overlooking the skyline, the lights of Chicago stretching endlessly beyond the glass. He had not changed out of his suit yet, a rare oversight that reflected how his attention had remained divided since returning from the hospital. On his desk lay a single report summarizing the final status of the Foundation case, confirming once again that all procedures had been executed correctly and all outcomes were stable. There was nothing unresolved on paper, nothing requiring further intervention, yet William found himself reading the same paragraph repeatedly without absorbing its finality. He walked slowly toward the window, loosening his tie slightly, his reflection blending with the city lights in a way that made him feel both present and distant at the same time. He had spent years building systems that functioned without emotional interference, yet this particular case had introduced a variable that did not fit within any structure he was accustomed to managing. Sarah Miller was not part of any strategic plan or corporate initiative, yet her presence in his awareness had persisted longer than he could rationally justify. He checked his phone once, then placed it face down on the desk, as if removing the source of information might also quiet the thoughts it carried. At the same moment, Sarah finally closed the medical folder completely and stood from the table, walking slowly toward Lily's crib. She watched her daughter for a long moment, the soft rise and fall of her breathing grounding her more than any explanation could. Whatever had happened that day had helped her child, and that fact alone was enough to keep her from rejecting it outright. Still, as she turned off the kitchen light and moved toward her small bedroom, the unanswered questions remained present, not loud but persistent, like something waiting just beyond the edge of understanding. In another part of the city, William remained by the window, his posture still, his thoughts quieter but not settled. For the first time in years, the clarity he relied on did not fully return when called, and in its place was a sense that something previously separated by time. An intention had begun to move again, not through force or decision, but through a sequence of events that neither system nor distance had fully accounted for. The night had settled fully over Chicago, wrapping the city in a deep quiet that softened even the brightest lights from the skyline, and inside her small apartment Sarah Miller stood near the kitchen sink staring at a glass she had already filled but forgotten to drink. The water reflected the faint glow of the ceiling lamp, trembling slightly as her hand rested against the counter, her thoughts still caught in a loop she could not easily break. Lily was asleep in the next room, and that silence should have brought relief, but instead it made Sarah more aware of her own mind, of the questions she had not answered and the patterns she could not ignore. Everything that had happened at the hospital returned again, not as separate events but as a single continuous thread that refused to unravel cleanly. The coordination, the approval, the absence of delay, the mention of systems she had never contacted directly. She pressed her fingers lightly against the edge of the counter, grounding herself in something physical, trying to separate intuition from exhaustion. Across the city, William Carter stood in his office with the lights dimmed, the city behind him stretching into a quiet grid of movement and reflection. He had dismissed his assistant for the evening, choosing silence over structure, something he rarely allowed himself without purpose. On his desk, the Foundation report remained open, but his attention was no longer on the text. It was on the pattern behind it, the sequence of events that had begun to feel less like administration and more like convergence. He had built his career on identifying patterns early, before they became visible to others, yet this one resisted classification. Sarah Miller was not part of any strategic model, and yet her presence had entered his awareness in a way that did not diminish with distance or time. He moved away from the desk slowly, walking toward the window, his reflection blending with the city lights below. For a long moment, he simply stood there, observing the movement of traffic far beneath him, each car a reminder of systems operating independently yet still connected by unseen structure. Meanwhile, Sarah returned to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, her phone resting beside her. It remained silent, but her attention kept drifting toward it as if expecting something she could not define. She considered the possibility of calling the hospital, of asking direct questions, but something held her back, a hesitation rooted not in fear but in uncertainty about what answers might actually reveal. She looked toward Lily's room again, listening to the steady rhythm of sleep, and made a quiet decision not to disturb that stability with questions she could not yet frame properly. In another part of the city, William finally stepped away from the window and returned to his desk, sitting down without turning on the main light. He opened a blank document on his screen, then stopped, his fingers hovering over the keyboard without movement. It was an unusual pause for him, one that did not come from indecision but from recognition that structure alone was no longer providing clarity. He closed the document without typing anything and leaned back slightly, exhaling in a controlled but quieter manner than usual. The thought of Sarah Miller did not arrive as a memory but as a presence, subtle and persistent, not tied to any single moment but to a sequence of small, unresolved impressions. He had expected distance to restore neutrality, but instead it had only made the awareness more distinct. Sarah, in her apartment, finally stood and walked toward the hallway, turning off the remaining lights one by one, moving through her space with quiet familiarity. Yet even in that routine, she felt something shifting beneath the surface of her day, not dramatic, not visible, but present in the way unanswered questions tend to remain after everything else has ended. William, in his silence, made no further decisions that night, but as he remained seated in the dim light of his office, he understood with a clarity he had not yet spoken aloud that whatever had begun at the hospital was no longer contained within procedure or coincidence, and that distance alone would not be enough to keep it from continuing. The first light of morning filtered through the glass windows of William Carter's office, casting long pale reflections across the polished floor, yet he had not moved from the chair where he had remained since the night before. The city below was already awake, streets filling with motion and sound, but inside the office everything felt suspended in a controlled silence that no longer brought clarity. William's gaze rested on the edge of his desk where the Foundation report still lay open, though he was no longer reading it. The words had lost structure in his mind, replaced by something less defined and far more persistent. He had spent years relying on systems that responded predictably to input and correction, but what he had observed over the past days did not behave like a system at all. It behaved like convergence without explanation. Sarah Miller was not part of his professional world, and yet her presence had begun to appear in places where she should not logically exist. He stood slowly, walking toward the window as the morning sun rose higher, the light spreading across the city in clean geometric patterns. From this height, everything looked organized, measurable, controlled. Yet William knew that control was only an interpretation, not a guarantee. He looked down at the street far below, where people moved through intersections unaware of the decisions shaping their day. Somewhere within that flow, Sarah Miller was continuing her life without knowledge of how closely it had intersected with his own structure. At the same time, Sarah was standing in her apartment kitchen, preparing a small breakfast for Lily, the routine motions grounding her in familiarity after a night of fragmented thoughts. The uncertainty from the previous days had not disappeared, but it had settled into something quieter, something she could temporarily set aside in order to function. Lily sat nearby in her small chair, watching her mother with calm attention as Sarah placed a plate on the table. The apartment was warm, ordinary, and unchanged, yet Sarah felt a subtle difference in how she experienced it. It was not fear, and not comfort, but awareness that something beyond her immediate view had shifted. She glanced at her phone briefly, then placed it face down without unlocking it. There were no new messages, but she no longer expected clarity to arrive in the form of notifications. Across the city, William finally turned away from the window and reached for his jacket. He had a scheduled Foundation briefing later that morning, a standard review of ongoing cases and resource allocations. On paper, everything remained routine, but he now understood that routine was no longer an accurate description of what was unfolding. He left his office without additional instructions, walking through the corridor with the same composed efficiency he always maintained, yet internally aware that his focus had already moved beyond scheduled structure. Meanwhile, Sarah finished preparing Lily's breakfast and sat down across from her daughter, watching her eat slowly with small, careful movements. For a brief moment, the simplicity of the scene allowed her thoughts to settle. But even in that quiet, she could not fully dismiss the sense that her life had been touched by something operating outside of her understanding. It was not dramatic, not disruptive in an obvious way, but it was present, like an alignment she had not chosen. William arrived at the Foundation building shortly after, entering through the private access corridor that led directly to the executive review room. Staff members greeted him with standard professionalism, and he acknowledged them without pause, maintaining the familiar distance that defined his role. Yet as he walked, he was no longer thinking in terms of reports or systems alone. He was thinking in patterns that no longer resolved neatly. Sarah Miller remained in his awareness not as an anomaly, but as an unresolved point within a sequence that had yet to complete itself. And somewhere, without either of them acknowledging it, the structure that had once separated their lives had begun to shift in ways neither time nor distance had fully contained. The morning at Mercy Medical Center felt different for Sarah Miller as she stepped through the entrance holding Lily's hand, the familiar automatic doors opening into a space that now carried a strange sense of memory rather than uncertainty. She had been here before, but today the air felt heavier, as if the building itself remembered something she had not yet fully understood. Lily walked beside her quietly, clutching a small toy, unaware of the subtle tension in her mother's posture. Sarah adjusted her daughter's jacket and continued forward, following the instructions for the follow-up appointment that had been scheduled without her intervention. She still did not know who had arranged it, only that the pattern of care continued without interruption, as if someone had decided that her life required fewer obstacles than it previously contained. At the same time, on the upper level of the same building, William Carter stood behind a glass partition in a private observation corridor, reviewing the final confirmation of the Foundation's schedule for the day. The follow-up appointment was listed clearly, along with every procedural detail that ensured it would proceed without disruption. Yet William was no longer focused on procedure. He was focused on timing. For days, he had maintained distance, observing only through systems and reports. But today he had made a decision that did not appear in any formal document. He closed the file on his tablet and placed it down carefully, his reflection visible in the glass as he turned toward the corridor that led to the consultation area. Each step he took was measured, not from uncertainty, but from recognition that avoidance no longer served clarity. Sarah entered the waiting room moments later, taking a seat with Lily beside her. The space was quiet, designed for comfort, yet she felt a familiar awareness rising again, the same sense she had experienced before without being able to explain its source. She looked down at the folder in her hands, then toward the hallway, noticing subtle movement beyond the glass panels. Something about the environment felt aligned in a way that was no longer coincidental. William paused at the end of the corridor, seeing her clearly now without obstruction. For a moment, he did not move. The distance between them was physical, but it no longer felt structural. It felt temporary. Sarah shifted slightly in her seat, and in doing so, her gaze lifted. Their eyes met across the space between rooms, not interrupted by glass or distance in the way it had been before. The recognition was not immediate in words, but in something deeper, something that bypassed explanation. Sarah stood slowly, holding Lily closer, her expression steady but no longer uncertain. William stepped forward, emerging fully into view, no longer observing from behind systems or oversight structures. The environment around them remained unchanged, staff moving quietly in the background, appointments continuing as scheduled, yet everything between them had narrowed to a single point of acknowledgement. Sarah spoke first, her voice calm but carrying the weight of everything she had not been able to name. She asked why everything had been arranged without explanation, why help had arrived without request, why her life had been guided without her understanding. William listened without interruption, his expression controlled but no longer distant. When she finished, there was a brief silence that did not feel empty, but complete. He finally answered without reference to systems or procedure, his voice lower than before, acknowledging what had not been said for a long time. He told her that distance had not been the same as absence, and that some decisions had been made believing they were protective rather than revealing. Sarah studied him for a long moment, her grip on Lily steady but no longer defensive. The tension that had followed her since the first hospital visit began to shift, not into resolution, but into understanding that remained unfinished. Around them, The hospital continued its rhythm, unchanged and indifferent, yet within that space something had finally moved from silence into recognition. William did not approach further, and Sarah did not step back. They remained in the same line of sight, no longer separated by absence of explanation, but by everything that still remained unsaid, and for the first time, neither distance nor structure defined what came next.